The large downtown courthouse buzzed with activity on a Tuesday morning. People rushed through security, lawyers chatted in corners, and clerks hurried with stacks of papers. In courtroom 7, Judge Richard Harmon prepared for another day of cases. He was known throughout the city for running an efficient courtroom, though many lawyers whispered about his impatience and harsh manner. At exactly 9:30 a.m., the bailiff called the next case. The doors at the back of the courtroom opened slowly as an elderly black woman made her way inside. Eleanor Jenkins was 78 years old, with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. She wore a simple navy dress and comfortable shoes. Her movements were careful as she used a wooden cane to support herself. The young lawyer representing the opposing side, Mark Thompson from Wilson and Reed Law Firm, glanced up from his expensive leather briefcase. A small smile appeared on his face when he saw Eleanor. This case would surely be quick and easy. His firm had sent 5 boxes of documents to overwhelm the other side, a common tactic they used against people without fancy lawyers. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Richard Harmon," announced the bailiff. Judge Harmon entered, his black robe flowing behind him. He sat down and quickly began reading through the case file. Without looking up, he waved for everyone to be seated. "Good morning, Your Honor," said Mark Thompson, standing tall in his perfectly tailored suit. Mark Thompson, representing West Side Development Corporation. The judge nodded, still focused on his papers. "And who represents the plaintiff in this matter?" Eleanor Jenkins rose slowly from her seat. "I will be representing myself in this case, Your Honor." Judge Harmon finally looked up, his eyebrows rising when he saw the elderly woman standing at the plaintiff's table. He let out a small sigh that everyone in the courtroom could hear. "Ma'am, are you sure you wouldn't prefer to have an attorney? These proceedings can be quite complex," Judge Harmon said, speaking slowly and loudly as if Eleanor might have trouble hearing. "I believe I can manage, Your Honor," Eleanor replied calmly. The judge exchanged a quick look with Mark Thompson, who barely hid his smirk. "Very well," Judge Harmon continued. "Mr. Thompson, you may present your motion to dismiss." Mark Thompson launched into a complex legal argument, using big words and citing multiple cases. He spoke quickly, occasionally glancing at Eleanor, who sat quietly taking notes with a simple pen and notepad. Several times, he mentioned statute of limitations and lack of standing while dropping names of famous court cases. When Thompson finished, the judge turned to Eleanor. "Mrs. Jenkins, do you understand what opposing counsel has presented?" "Ms. Jenkins," she corrected politely. "And yes, I understand completely." "Then you must realize your case has serious problems," Judge Harmon said, his tone becoming condescending. "Perhaps it would be best if you considered their settlement offer. At your age, a lengthy court battle might be challenging." A few people in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably at the judge's tone. Eleanor's expression remained calm, though her eyes showed a flash of something, not anger, but determination. "Thank you for your concern, Your Honor," Eleanor said, rising again with her cane. "But I would like to respond to their motion, if I may." Judge Harmon waved his hand dismissively. "Go ahead, but please keep it brief. The court has a full docket today." Little did he know, Eleanor Jenkins was just getting started. Eleanor Jenkins stood confidently despite her age. The courtroom was quiet as she prepared to speak. She placed her simple notebook on the table and adjusted her reading glasses. "Your Honor, I understand Mr. Thompson's arguments. They are based on misinterpretations of the law," Eleanor began, her voice steady and clear. Before she could continue, Judge Harmon interrupted her. "Mrs. Jenkins." "Ms. Jenkins," she corrected him again, politely but firmly. The judge frowned. "Ms. Jenkins, please remember that this is a court of law, not a neighborhood dispute. Legal arguments require proper understanding of complex principles." A few people in the audience exchanged uncomfortable glances. The judge's tone was unnecessarily harsh. "I understand, Your Honor," Eleanor replied calmly. "If I may continue." Briefly, Judge Harmon cut in, checking his watch. "We don't have all day." Eleanor nodded and began again. "The defendant claims the statute of limitations has expired, but they've overlooked the Henderson ruling of 2014, which clearly states—" "Dear lady," Judge Harmon interrupted again, this time with a sigh, "Henderson applies to corporate entities, not individual complaints." Perhaps you're thinking of a different case. Mark Thompson chuckled quietly. Several junior lawyers from his firm, sitting in the first row, smirked at each other. I am referring to Henderson v. Westside Properties. Eleanor continued undeterred. The ruling specifically addressed both corporate and individual plaintiffs. Judge Harmon leaned forward, speaking slowly as if to a child. Ms. Jenkins, are you sure you wouldn't like to take a short break? These matters can be confusing for non-lawyers, especially those who might be dealing with the challenges of advanced age. Whispers spread through the courtroom. The court reporter looked up with wide eyes, clearly shocked at the judge's words. I appreciate your concern, Eleanor said, her dignity intact. But I assure you, my memory is quite sound. She turned to her notes and continued. Regarding Mr. Thompson's second point about lack of standing, I would direct the court's attention to Section 47.3 of the City Code. Judge Harmon rolled his eyes slightly. Ms. Jenkins, city codes are not typically cited in this type of proceeding. They are when the defendant's actions directly violate those codes, Your Honor, Eleanor responded. And the violation of those codes gives me standing as an affected resident. Mark Thompson jumped to his feet. Your Honor, this is ridiculous. Ms. Jenkins clearly doesn't understand basic legal procedure. We're wasting the court's valuable time. I tend to agree, Judge Harmon said, nodding. Ms. Jenkins, I'm trying to help you. These young lawyers from Wilson and Reed handle hundreds of cases like yours. They know what they're doing. Eleanor remained composed despite the disrespect. I understand the challenges, Your Honor. However, if you'll allow me to continue my argument. 2 more minutes, Judge Harmon said with a dismissive wave of his hand. Then I'll rule on the motion to dismiss. Eleanor nodded and opened a worn legal book she had brought with her. If the court will consider the precedent set in Wilkins v. City of Boston, a case that established a citizen's right to challenge development projects that violate established zoning regulations. As she spoke, the young court clerk's expression changed from boredom to surprise. She looked more closely at Eleanor, then typed something quickly into her computer. Judge Harmon wasn't listening. He was checking his calendar for his next case while Mark Thompson sat confidently, already texting his boss about their sure victory. But in the back of the courtroom, an older attorney who had just walked in froze in the doorway, staring at Eleanor with growing recognition. He whispered something to his colleague, who looked equally shocked. The whispers began to spread through the back rows. Something unexpected was happening in courtroom 7. Eleanor Jenkins continued her argument with remarkable composure despite the judge's obvious impatience. Her voice remained steady as she methodically addressed each point raised by the opposing counsel. Now, regarding the property assessment values that Mr. Thompson mentioned, Eleanor said, flipping through her notepad, I would like to submit these documents for the court's consideration. Mark Thompson rose quickly from his seat. Your Honor, we haven't received any documents from Ms. Jenkins. This is completely improper procedure. As I said before, she clearly doesn't understand how court works. Judge Harmon sighed heavily. Ms. Jenkins, you can't simply bring new evidence without properly sharing it with the opposing side first. These aren't new documents, Your Honor, Eleanor replied calmly. They're the defendant's own financial statements that were filed with the City Planning Commission last year. They are public records that contradict the figures Mr. Thompson presented earlier. The judge frowned. Even public records need to be properly introduced, Ms. Jenkins. This isn't a TV show where you spring surprises. A few people in the courtroom chuckled at the judge's remark. Eleanor simply nodded and reached into her worn leather bag. You're right, Your Honor. That's why I filed these exact documents with the court 3 weeks ago and sent copies to Wilson and Reed's office, as shown by this certified mail receipt. She held up a small green paper. Page 16 of their own filing acknowledges receiving them. Mark Thompson's confident smile faltered as he hastily flipped through his papers. The junior lawyers behind him began searching through their boxes of documents. I can't find any record of this, Thompson said, his voice slightly higher than before. Check Exhibit C in your own filing, Mr. Thompson, Eleanor suggested gently. As Thompson frantically searched his papers, Eleanor continued. While counsel looks for those documents, I'd like to address his attempt to introduce the Baker Street survey without proper authentication. She pulled out a thick legal book and opened it to a market page. According to Nichols v. Crawford County, 1983, environmental impact studies must be authenticated by the original surveyor or a qualified expert who can verify the methodology used. Judge Harmon's eyebrows rose slightly. He leaned forward, suddenly paying more attention. That's a very specific case to cite, Ms. Jenkins. Are you certain about that reference? Quite certain, Your Honor. Justice Brennan's majority opinion specifically addressed the issue of unauthenticated technical documents on page 437. I believe the exact wording was technical surveys, absent expert testimony, constitute hearsay, and lack the reliability necessary for judicial consideration. The young court clerk stopped typing and looked up in surprise. She stared at Eleanor for a long moment, then quickly typed something into her computer. Her eyes widened as she read whatever appeared on her screen. Meanwhile, Mark Thompson had found the document Eleanor mentioned. Your Honor, he admitted reluctantly, it appears the documents were indeed received by our office, but they were misfiled. Misfiled? Judge Harmon repeated skeptically. Yes, Your Honor. An unfortunate clerical error, Thompson said, his confidence clearly shaken. The whispers at the back of the courtroom grew louder. The older attorney who had entered earlier was now speaking urgently to another lawyer, both of them looking at Eleanor with growing recognition. Judge Harmon noticed the commotion. Order, he said sharply, banging his gavel. Then he turned back to Eleanor. Ms. Jenkins, your objection regarding the Baker Street survey is well-founded. Eleanor nodded politely. Thank you, Your Honor. Additionally, I would point out that Mr. Thompson's reference to the West Side zoning exemption is based on outdated law. The state Supreme Court overturned that provision last year in Garcia v. Urban Planning Commission. The court clerk was now frantically writing a note. She folded it and passed it to the bailiff, pointing urgently toward the judge. As Eleanor continued methodically dismantling the opposition's case, Judge Harmon's expression gradually changed from dismissive to puzzled. Something about this elderly woman didn't fit with his initial assumptions. The bailiff approached the bench and handed the note to Judge Harmon. As he read it, his face began to drain of color. Judge Harmon stared at the note in his hands. His eyes widened as he read it again, making sure he understood correctly. The courtroom continued as normal around him. Mark Thompson shuffled papers nervously while Eleanor Jenkins calmly organized her notes. But for the judge, everything had suddenly changed. Your Honor, Eleanor asked politely. May I continue? The judge looked up, seeing Eleanor Jenkins in a completely new light. Yes. However, I think this might be a good time for a 15-minute recess. He banged his gavel quickly. Court will resume at 11:45. As Judge Harmon hurried from the bench, whispers spread through the courtroom. Eleanor sat down slowly, taking a small bottle of water from her bag. She appeared completely calm, unlike Mark Thompson, who was frantically conferring with his junior associates. In his chambers, Judge Harmon paced back and forth, the clerk's note still in his hand. His law clerk, Jessica Chen, stood nervously by the door. Is this information correct? The judge demanded, waving the paper. Are you absolutely certain? Yes, Your Honor, Jessica replied. I double-checked when I recognized some of her case citations. Eleanor Jenkins Washington graduated top of her class from Howard University Law School in 1967. She was the first black woman to argue before the Supreme Court in the landmark civil rights case Robinson v. Metropolitan Housing Authority. The judge collapsed into his chair. And I've been treating her like... There's more, Jessica continued. She was dean of Stanford Law School for 12 years. She wrote the definitive textbook on property law that every law student in America studies. 3 of her former students are currently sitting on the Supreme Court. Judge Harmon rubbed his temples. How did I not recognize her name? She usually goes by Jenkins Washington professionally, but uses Jenkins for personal matters, Jessica had explained. And she's been semi-retired for the past 5 years, mostly doing pro bono work for community cases like this one. The judge pulled out his phone and quickly searched her name. Dozens of images appeared. Eleanor Jenkins Washington receiving awards, speaking at major legal conferences, standing on the steps of the Supreme Court. In many photos, she stood with some of the most respected legal minds in the country. Oh my God, he whispered. I've been lecturing one of the most influential legal scholars of the past 50 years like she's a confused old woman. Outside in the hallway, word was spreading quickly. Lawyers from other courtrooms were finding excuses to peek into courtroom 7. A young law student who had been observing another case was excitedly texting his classmates. "The Eleanor Jenkins Washington is here." Back in the courtroom, Mark Thompson was getting increasingly worried as he checked his phone. His boss had sent an urgent message. "Do you know who you're up against? Call me immediately." Thompson slipped out to the hallway and called his senior partner. "What's going on?" "It's just some old lady representing herself." "You idiot," his boss hissed through the phone. "That old lady is Professor Eleanor Jenkins Washington. She wrote half the legal strategy our firm uses for property disputes. I studied under her at Stanford. She's a living legend." Thompson's face went pale. But she's just using simple arguments and basic citations. "Because that's all she needs. If she's involved, there's something important about this case we're missing. Check the property records again, check the zoning laws, check everything. And for God's sake, show some respect when court resumes." As the 15-minute recess neared its end, the courtroom had mysteriously filled to capacity. Legal interns, paralegals, and attorneys from throughout the building found excuses to be present. Everyone wanted to witness what would happen next. Judge Harmon returned to his chambers, straightened his robe, and took several deep breaths. In his 20 years on the bench, he had never been so embarrassed or humbled. The bailiff approached him. "Ready, Your Honor." Judge Harmon nodded grimly. "Yes, and please tell Ms. Jenkins, Professor Jenkins Washington, that I'd like to speak with her privately after this session." The bailiff raised his eyebrows but nodded. As Judge Harmon prepared to re-enter the courtroom, he knew his reputation would never be the same after today. The story of how he had mocked Eleanor Jenkins Washington would spread through legal circles across the country by dinner time. He took one final deep breath and reached for the door. The bailiff's voice rang out across the now-packed courtroom. "All rise. Court is back in session, the Honorable Judge Richard Harmon presiding." Judge Harmon entered the courtroom with a noticeably different demeanor. His usual confident stride was replaced by a careful, measured walk. His eyes, which had barely acknowledged Eleanor Jenkins earlier, now kept glancing in her direction with unmistakable respect. "Please be seated," he said, his voice softer than before. The rustling of people settling down seemed louder than usual because the courtroom was now filled to capacity. Law clerks, attorneys from other cases, and even a few courthouse staff had found excuses to be present. Judge Harmon cleared his throat. "Before we continue, I'd like to address a misunderstanding." He adjusted his glasses nervously. "Ms. Jenkins, I've just been informed of your distinguished background. I believe the court would be better served if we properly acknowledged your credentials." Eleanor looked up calmly, her hands folded neatly on the table. She showed no sign of satisfaction or vindication. "Professor Eleanor Jenkins Washington," Judge Harmon continued, emphasizing her full professional name, former dean of Stanford Law School and author of Constitutional Principles in Property Law, which, I might add, was required reading when I attended law school. A murmur swept through the courtroom. Mark Thompson's face had turned an alarming shade of red. His junior associates looked like they wanted to disappear under their table. "Your Honor," Eleanor spoke clearly, "I appreciate the acknowledgement, but I'm here today simply as a concerned citizen. My credentials, while perhaps interesting, aren't relevant to the merits of this case." Judge Harmon nodded, visibly humbled. "Of course, Professor. Please proceed with your argument where we left off." Eleanor rose slowly, using her cane for support. Despite her physical fragility, her legal mind was clearly as sharp as ever. "Thank you, Your Honor. As I was explaining, the defendants claim that community input was properly sought is contradicted by their own meeting minutes." She pulled out a simple folder. "On page 47, paragraph 3, we can see that the community forum was scheduled for a Tuesday morning at 10 a.m., when most residents would be at work." She handed copies to the clerk to distribute. Further, the only notice was posted on the municipal building's bulletin board, not in the community newspaper as required by Section 8.3 of the city charter. Mark Thompson, trying to recover his composure, stood up. "Your Honor, Technicalities about meeting notices don't invalidate the entire project. Eleanor turned toward him, her expression kind but firm. Mr. Thompson, in Carson v. Millbrook Development, the state Supreme Court ruled that procedural requirements in community development are not mere technicalities but essential safeguards of democratic process. She smiled slightly. I believe you're familiar with that case, as your own firm cited it last year in the Westridge Mall dispute. Thompson's mouth opened and closed without any words coming out. One of his junior associates whispered urgently in his ear. Judge Harmon, who had been listening intently, nodded. The court is familiar with Carson. Please continue, Professor. Eleanor proceeded methodically through her arguments. Her style was clear and simple, without flashy legal jargon or dramatic gestures. She didn't need theatrics. Her mastery of the law spoke for itself. The audience watched in admiration as she dismantled the opposing counsel's case point by point. Several young lawyers were frantically taking notes. This was a rare opportunity to see a legal legend in action. Judge Harmon, who had interrupted Eleanor repeatedly before the recess, now listened attentively. When she finished, he turned to Mark Thompson. Counselor, your response to Professor Jenkins Washington's arguments? Thompson stood, straightening his expensive tie. The confident smirk from earlier was gone, replaced by genuine concern. Your Honor, in light of these new perspectives, my clients would like to request a brief adjournment to reconsider certain aspects of our position. In other words, they needed time to regroup now that they knew who they were really up against. As the courtroom waited for Judge Harmon to decide on Thompson's request for adjournment, the atmosphere was charged with anticipation. Several older attorneys in the back row whispered among themselves, sharing stories about Eleanor Jenkins Washington's remarkable career. I'll allow a 30-minute recess, Judge Harmon finally announced. But be prepared to continue today, Mr. Thompson. This matter has already been delayed long enough. As people rose from their seats, a distinguished older man approached Eleanor. He was James Carter, the county's most senior black judge, who had taken a rare break from his own courtroom after hearing who was present in courtroom 7. Professor Jenkins Washington, he said warmly, extending his hand. I don't know if you remember me, but I was in your constitutional law class in 1984. Eleanor smiled genuinely. Judge Carter, of course I remember. Your paper on equal protection was one of the finest I ever received. Others gathered around, eager to speak with her. For the younger lawyers and law students present, this was like meeting a living legend. The story of Eleanor Jenkins Washington was one taught in every law school in America. Born in 1946 in a small southern town, Eleanor had faced barriers that seemed insurmountable. Her journey to law school began when she witnessed an eviction in her neighborhood as a teenager. The family had been paying rent faithfully, but the landlord claimed otherwise. With no lawyer to help them, they lost everything. That day, I decided the law shouldn't just be a tool for those with money and power, Eleanor once wrote in her memoir. It should protect everyone equally. In 1963, she was one of only 3 black women accepted to Howard University Law School. Despite graduating at the top of her class in 1967, no major law firm would hire her. Instead, she joined a small civil rights practice, taking cases no one else would touch. In 1971, she argued her first Supreme Court case, representing a group of black families fighting housing discrimination. Against all expectations, she won. It was the first of her 5 Supreme Court victories that would reshape American civil rights law. A young law clerk approached hesitantly. Professor, is it true you once stood up to Justice Reynolds when he interrupted your argument? Eleanor laughed softly. Well, I simply reminded him that the court's own rules allowed me 20 minutes of uninterrupted time. He wasn't pleased, but he did let me finish. In the hallway outside, Mark Thompson was having an urgent phone conversation with his senior partners. His face grew increasingly distressed as they spoke. But we can't just drop the case, he argued. Our client has millions invested in this development. Listen to me carefully, the senior partner replied. Jenkins Washington doesn't take cases she can't win. If she's representing these community members, there's something solid in their claim. Find out what it is and prepare a reasonable settlement. If this goes to trial and we lose, it'll set precedent that could affect a dozen other developments we're handling. Inside the courtroom, Eleanor sat quietly, reviewing her notes. Despite her fame and accomplishments, she remained humble. Throughout her career, she had turned down lucrative offers from prestigious firms, choosing instead to teach and take on cases for those who couldn't afford legal representation. Her landmark textbook on property law, published in 1985, challenged traditional interpretations that favored wealthy landowners over community interests. Many of her former students now sat on federal benches or headed civil rights organizations. In 1992, she became the first black woman to serve as dean of Stanford Law School, transforming its curriculum to emphasize ethical responsibility and community service alongside traditional legal theory. As the 30-minute recess neared its end, Judge Harmon sat in his chambers, reading through Eleanor's most famous Supreme Court argument. He had studied it in law school without ever imagining he would one day have its author in his courtroom, an author he had disrespected just hours earlier. The bailiff knocked on his door. "Everyone's ready, Your Honor." Judge Harmon nodded, closing the book. "I'm ready too," he said, though his voice suggested he might not be entirely confident about that. Court resumed with a different energy. The packed courtroom fell silent as Judge Harmon took his seat. His usual confident demeanor was replaced by thoughtful attention. He no longer checked his watch or showed signs of impatience. "Mr. Thompson, is the defense ready to proceed?" Judge Harmon asked. Mark Thompson stood, his expensive suit no longer projecting the same authority it had earlier. "Yes, Your Honor. However, after consulting with my colleagues, we would like to propose a brief settlement conference with Professor Jenkins Washington and her clients." Judge Harmon turned to Eleanor. "Professor, what are your thoughts on this request?" Eleanor rose slowly, supporting herself with her cane. "Your Honor, while we appreciate Mr. Thompson's suggestion, my clients have been trying to negotiate for 8 months. They've attended 12 community meetings, sent 27 letters, and submitted 4 formal complaints. The developer has dismissed their concerns at every turn." She paused. "We are prepared to continue with today's hearing." The judge nodded. "Then we will proceed. Mr. Thompson, your response to the plaintiff's arguments." Thompson cleared his throat. "Your Honor, while we maintain that all proper procedures were followed, we acknowledge that perhaps more community input could have been beneficial." He glanced at the notes his team had frantically prepared during the recess. "However, the economic benefits of this development cannot be overstated. It will bring jobs and tax revenue to an area that desperately needs both." Eleanor listened patiently, making occasional notes. When Thompson finished his somewhat weakened argument, Judge Harmon turned to her. "Professor Jenkins Washington, your response." Eleanor rose again. The courtroom was completely silent as she began to speak. "Your Honor, economic benefits never justify ignoring the law. My clients don't oppose development. They oppose being excluded from decisions that affect their homes, their children, and their futures." Her voice, though soft with age, carried a power that held everyone's attention. She spoke without legal jargon, making complex principles crystal clear. As she continued her closing argument, Judge Harmon leaned forward, completely engaged. "The Sullivan Housing Act of 1992 specifically requires meaningful community participation in developments receiving tax incentives. The Supreme Court defined meaningful in Williams v. Urban Development Corporation as participation that can actually influence outcomes, not merely the opportunity to voice concerns that will be ignored." She referenced 3 more precedents, each time citing the exact page and paragraph without consulting notes. Several law students in the back row exchanged amazed glances. One whispered to another, "She's quoting from memory. Those cases are decades old." Eleanor continued, "Your Honor, we're not asking for special treatment. We're asking for what the law already guarantees, the right of citizens to have a real voice in changes to their community." As she spoke, Judge Harmon's expression showed a man experiencing a profound shift in perspective. He had begun the day dismissing an elderly black woman as confused and out of her depth. Now he was witnessing a masterclass in legal advocacy from someone who had shaped the very laws he applied every day. When Eleanor finished, the courtroom remained silent for several seconds. Then Judge Harmon spoke, his tone respectful and thoughtful. "Thank you, Professor Jenkins Washington." He turned to Mark Thompson. "Counselor, do you have any final remarks?" Thompson, seeing the way the judge looked at Eleanor, simply said, We rest on our previous arguments, Your Honor. Judge Harmon nodded. Very well. I believe I have sufficient information to rule on this matter. He paused, looking down at his notes, then back up at the courtroom. Based on the evidence and arguments presented, I find that the West Side Development Corporation failed to meet the community engagement requirements specified in both municipal code and state law. He turned to Eleanor. The plaintiff's motion for injunction is granted. All construction must cease until proper community input procedures have been completed and documented. A small smile appeared on Eleanor's face, not triumphant, just satisfied that justice had been served. Judge Harmon continued, additionally, I'm ordering the developer to pay reasonable legal costs for the plaintiffs. He looked directly at Eleanor. Professor Jenkins Washington, the court thanks you for your exceptional advocacy and clear presentation of the relevant legal principles. The message was clear to everyone present. Judge Richard Harmon had learned a valuable lesson about assumptions and respect, a lesson he wouldn't soon forget. Court is adjourned, Judge Harmon declared, bringing down his gavel one final time. The sound echoed through the packed courtroom, marking the end of a case that had taken an unexpected turn. As people rose from their seats, a small crowd gathered around Eleanor Jenkins Washington. Several young law students approached her nervously, clutching legal pads and hoping for an autograph or a word of advice. Community members who had been fighting the development for months came forward with tears in their eyes, offering heartfelt thanks. Professor Jenkins Washington, thank you for saving our neighborhood, said Mrs. Rodriguez, an elderly woman who had lived in the affected area for 40 years. We couldn't afford a fancy lawyer, and nobody would listen to us. Eleanor smiled warmly. Justice shouldn't depend on what you can afford, Mrs. Rodriguez. Your community deserved to be heard. Across the room, Mark Thompson was packing up his expensive briefcase, his face showing a mixture of embarrassment and defeat. His junior associates avoided eye contact with him, knowing the senior partners would not be pleased with today's outcome. As the crowd around Eleanor slowly dispersed, Judge Harmon approached her. The courtroom had emptied enough that their conversation wouldn't be overheard. The judge's usual commanding presence was replaced by genuine humility. Professor Jenkins Washington, he began, his voice low. I owe you an apology. My behavior earlier was inexcusable. Eleanor looked at him thoughtfully, her wise eyes taking his measure. Judge Harmon, may I speak frankly? Of course, he nodded, bracing himself. What happened today happens to people who look like me every day, in courtrooms, hospitals, businesses, and schools across this country, she said calmly. The only difference is that most of them don't have Supreme Court arguments on their resume to make others reconsider their assumptions. Judge Harmon's face flushed with shame. You're absolutely right, and I want you to know that I'm truly sorry. Eleanor nodded. Apology accepted. But more important than your words to me are your actions toward the next person who enters your courtroom without an expensive suit or prestigious law firm behind them. I understand, he said quietly. Today has been educational. Good, Eleanor replied. Justice doesn't see age, gender, or color, Your Honor. I trust you'll remember that with others who appear before you. As she turned to leave, Judge Harmon asked one more question. Professor, if you don't mind my asking, why did you take this case yourself? With your reputation, you could have assigned it to any number of attorneys who would have jumped at the chance to work with you. Eleanor smiled. Because Mrs. Rodriguez reminded me of my mother. Because this community reminds me of where I grew up. And because after 50 years practicing law, I still believe that justice matters, especially for those who have to fight hardest to obtain it. With that, she gathered her simple briefcase and made her way slowly toward the door, using her cane for support. In the courthouse hallway, news of what had happened was already spreading. Lawyers, clerks, and judges gathered in small groups, discussing how the legendary Eleanor Jenkins Washington had taught Judge Harmon, and everyone present, a powerful lesson about respect and assumptions. 2 young black female law students watched Eleanor with awe as she walked toward the elevator. Excuse me, Professor Jenkins Washington? One of them called out hesitantly. We're first-year law students at State University. Could you give us any advice? Eleanor stopped and turned toward them. Remember that the law is a tool, not a master. Use it to help those who need it most. and never let anyone's assumptions about you define what you can achieve. She smiled warmly at them. The courtrooms of tomorrow will be yours. Make them places where justice truly is blind. As Eleanor Jenkins Washington stepped into the elevator and the doors closed behind her, she left behind a courthouse forever changed by her presence. Judge Harmon returned to his chambers with a new perspective that would influence every case he heard from that day forward. And somewhere in the building, court clerks were already beginning to share the story that would become a courthouse legend. The day a judge mocked an elderly black woman in court, only to discover she was one of the greatest legal minds of her generation.